Welcome to Bedtime Sleepy History. Dim your lights, let the weight of the day melt away, and gently close your eyes. Tonight, we drift far back through time, beyond the memory of nations, to the warm sands and quiet winds of ancient Egypt, where golden temples shimmered under the sun, and rulers known as pharaohs walked among their people as gods on earth. Tonight, we explore the world where kings married their sisters, not out of romance, but something older, deeper, and far more complex. So let yourself float gently now, as we begin the long, sleepy journey into the lives of those who rule by divine right, and bound blood to blood. The heat of the Nile Valley shimmered like a curtain above the riverbanks, and in the stillness of the desert sun, time seemed to stretch and sag, as if history itself had grown drowsy under the golden light. In this quiet, sun-drenched world, the ancient civilization of Egypt thrived, not in bursts of violent conquest or sudden explosions of innovation, but in a slow, enduring rhythm that echoed the steady flooding of a Nile. For thousands of years, kings known as pharaohs sat atop a structure more enduring than stone, a hierarchy of gods and men so tightly woven that the line between the divine and the earthly all but disappeared. These rulers were more than political leaders. They were believed to be gods made flesh, the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed deity of kingship, and the direct descendants of Ra, the sun god, whose presence warmed every inch of the land from sunrise to sunset. And to maintain the sacred identity, to preserve the illusion, the faith, and the foundation upon which all of Egypt rested, the pharaohs built palaces of ideology as much as limestone. Their lives, their customs, their rituals, all were constructed not merely for governance, but for performance of eternity. Among these customs, one practice would echo through the sands of time and puzzle the minds of future generations: the royal tradition of sibling marriage. For while the common people of Egypt lived modestly and chose spouses from their communities, the pharaohs often turned inward, marrying their own sisters, and at times even their daughters, sealing bonds not merely of family, but of blood, power, and myth. This was no accident, nor an indulgence of whim or desire, but a decision rooted in the sacred soil of Egyptian cosmology, where the line between ritual and reality had long since blurred. The pharaoh was not a husband in the modern sense, nor was his wife a partner in love or domesticity. She was instead the earthly mirror of Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood, sister and consort of Osiris. And just as the gods had married within their divine family, so too did the pharaohs, imitating the sacred union that created the world and reaffirming with every royal wedding that their bloodline was not merely noble, it was holy. The mythology of ancient Egypt did not whisper these truths. It proclaimed them boldly, etched into temple walls, painted on papyrus scrolls, and chanted in the deep, echoing corridors of sacred shrines. In the Heliopolitan creation myth, the world began not with an external spark, but with the god Adam, who emerged from the waters of chaos and, through a lonely act of self-creation, brought forth Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, who then bore Geb and Nut, earth and sky, who in turn became lovers and gave birth to Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. In this divine family, brothers and sisters wed without shame, without hesitation, for there was no other source of purity, no other blood that carried the essence of the cosmos. When pharaohs married their sisters, they were not breaking moral codes. They were reenacting the sacred origins of existence, drawing a straight, unbroken line from the gods to themselves, a line so vital to their authority that its disruption could have shaken the kingdom more than any army or famine. And so, in the corridors of palaces carved from red granite and adorned with blue and gold, young girls were prepared from birth not merely to be wives, but to be queens, sisters, and symbols of divine continuity. Some resisted quietly. Others embraced their role with elegance and calculation, understanding that their status as great royal wife, a title far more than ceremonial, would afford them influence within the secluded world of the court. For while Egypt was a land of men in public, behind the screens and columns of the royal compounds, it was often women, royal sisters, royal mothers, who shaped succession, advised the priests, and whispered influence into the ears of kings. To marry a sister, then, was not only a religious act but a political one, preserving both the godly aura of the pharaoh and the power structures that depended upon it. The union prevented outside families from claiming legitimacy through marriage, kept wealth from escaping the royal circle, and, crucially, ensure that the child who would one day rule could claim divinity from both mother and father. This, too, was essential in a culture where legitimacy was not only a matter of blood, but of ritual purity. In a world without modern concepts of genetics, the danger of inbreeding was not understood in biological terms. What mattered was not the health of the body, but the unbroken flame of the divine spirit. If a child was born of a king and a commoner, even one of noble background, they might carry the blood of the throne, but not the breath of the gods. Only when both parents descended from the same sacred line, the same union of Horus and Isis, could the heir to the throne carry the full weight of divine right. And so the cycle continued, generation after generation, like the Nile's waters rolling endlessly from the heart of Africa to the mouth of the Mediterranean, a system as grand and fragile as the desert temples themselves. In this tightly controlled world, love was secondary to lineage, and desire bowed to dynasty. To marry a sister was to reinforce a wall of sacred exclusivity around the throne, a wall that outsiders could not scale. And while the practice might seem strange, even unsettling to modern sensibilities, in its own time it was seen not as deviance, but devotion. The Pharaoh did not choose whom he loved. He chose whom the gods had decreed, and that decree came not from longing or affection, but from tradition older than time, etched in stone and sung by priests who had never known a world without such unions. To modern ears it may seem strange, but to ancient eyes it was divine order, maintained in silence and ritual, sustained in temples and tombs, and repeated quietly in the royal chambers of Thebes and Memphis and Achaemenid, where pharaohs whispered the old words as they stood beside their sisters, wives, and queens, ready to continue the line that stretched endlessly back to the dawn of the world. And so, the stage was set for a royal system in which bloodlines spiraled inward rather than outward, tracing tighter and tighter loops of sacred kinship as each pharaoh inherited not just a throne, but a burden of continuity, the heavy task of appearing eternal in a world where all things pass. The desert winds still carried their secrets through the temple ruins, long after the last royal sibling marriage had faded into myth and dust. While the world beyond Egypt looked upon sibling marriage with horror or suspicion within the sunlit chambers of Thebes or the shadowed halls of Memphis, such unions were neither whispered about nor hidden away. They were announced in gilded inscriptions, celebrated with festivals of incense and harp music, and carved forever into the walls of stone tombs meant to last eternity. And to understand why such an arrangement was not merely accepted, but institutionalized and repeated for generations, one must begin to peel back the sacred symbolism of the pharaoh himself, a figure who was not only a mortal ruler, but a living deity in the eyes of his people, the flesh and blood embodiment of Horus on earth, destined to become Osiris in death, and forever bound to the divine cycle of rebirth, rule, and return. It is from this web of myth and belief, so intricately spun across centuries, that the logic of royal sibling marriage begins to reveal itself, like the slow unfurling of a papyrus scroll beneath the gentle fingers of a priest in the temple of Karnak. To the ancient Egyptians, creation was not a chaotic accident or divine conflict, as it was in many other early mythologies. It was instead the unfolding of perfect order from a primal void, a deliberate and sacred emergence of life through balance, harmony, and divine union. And at the heart of this creation myth stood the first divine siblings, Isis and Osiris, born from a union of the sky goddess Nut and the earth god Geb. These two deities were not merely siblings. They were also husband and wife, a pairing that formed the cornerstone of Egyptian cosmology and spiritual continuity. To imitate the sacred bond, pharaohs often took their sisters as wives, not out of romantic longing, but to mirror the original divine pair, to establish themselves as heirs not only to a throne but to the order of the cosmos itself, weaving their bloodline directly into the fabric of the heavens. This religious imitation was not simply symbolic. It had very real implications for how power was perceived, inherited, and maintained. The royal house of Egypt was not a family in the way we think of families today. It was more akin to a divine mechanism, a lineage of sacred vessels carefully constructed to contain and transmit holy authority from one generation to the next. By marrying within the bloodline, a pharaoh could concentrate the sacred essence, much like a priest might distill holy oil from a grove of sacred trees. The queen, often referred to as the great royal wife, was not just a consort. She was a goddess incarnate, frequently associated with Hathor or Isis, whose union with the king was a ritual of renewal for the land itself. To marry a sister therefore, was to restore and reenact divine order, to perform a living ceremony in which the gods walked again among men, even if only for a brief reign under the desert sun. And it was not only the gods who sanctioned this custom. The logic of power itself made sibling marriage desirable for those perched atop a civilization whose very stability depended on perception of divine legitimacy. Egypt, vast and ancient even in its own time, had no shortage of internal rivalries, ambitious nobles, and scheming priesthoods, all of whom might attempt to fracture the seamless image of divine kingship. Marrying within the royal line helped preserve the clarity of succession, reducing the chance of outside blood entering the sacred family tree and clouding the political landscape with conflicting claims. In a kingdom where even the slightest hint of illegitimacy could spark unrest, or worse, civil war, the Pharaohs chose containment over openness, divine precedent over mortal flexibility, and purity of lineage over romantic novelty. But to modernize, trained by generations of Western literature and moral frameworks, such a practice feels at best unusual and at worst abhorrent. It is important, then, to gently step out of the assumptions of our own age and into the mindset of people who lived in a completely different symbolic universe, one in which biology served religion, and where the body of Pharaoh was not merely flesh, but a temple, a metaphor, and a microcosm of the divine. Sibling marriage was not practiced broadly among the general population. It was a royal ritual, a tradition of the elite, often accompanied by other marriages outside the family for political alliances or fertility. But for the throne, that sacred seat raised high above the mortal world, the rules were different. They had to be. And so we find, carved into the lintels of sun-baked tombs and echoed in papyri long faded with age, the names of queens who were also sisters, priestesses who were also wives, daughters who were also brides. Figures like Amos Nefertari, the revered matriarch of the 18th dynasty, or Cinnamon, the daughter and wife of Amenhotep III. These women were not pawns in some perverse game. They were revered, worshipped, elevated to divine status in their own right. Their marriages, however uncomfortable they may seem today, were not acts of secrecy, but spectacles of statecraft, religion, and divine symbolism. They were marriages that sustained the illusion, or perhaps the reality, that the divine still walked the earth in the form of a man and woman joined not only by blood, but by destiny. Of course, not every pharaoh chose this path, and the practice was not universal across all dynasties or periods. But when it was employed, it was done so with deep intentionality, not casually, not out of scarcity of partners, and certainly not out of personal desire alone. It was rather an extension of Egypt's broader view of the cosmos, orderly, cyclical, and built upon a reflection of divine patterns within the mortal realm. Just as the Nile flowed from the mysterious south to the fertile delta, just as the sun died each night and was reborn each dawn, so too did the royal line seek to reproduce the eternal balance of gods through its unions, strange to us now, but utterly coherent to them then. And so, the sacred bloodlines moved forward, generation by generation, winding through the centuries like the river that sustained them, each union a new stitch in the great tapestry of kingship, each marriage a reflection of the first divine embrace. It is in this sense that the practice must be understood, not as mere custom or even politics, but as something far older and deeper, a living echo of the gods whose love shaped the stars and whose order sustained the world. And as we move forward along the golden path of dynasties, through the silent corridors of history, where stone eyes still watch in the shadows, we begin to see how this sacred logic endured, how even amid change and chaos, the ritual of divine union remained a steady flame, flickering in the long night of human memory. It was within this ever-tightening loop of sacred obligation and dynastic duty that the role of royal women began to crystallize into something far beyond simple companionship. For a pharaoh's sister was not merely a sibling or potential bride, but a living embodiment of both earthly lineage and divine partnership, a reflection of the sky goddess Nut or the throne goddess Isis, whose marriage to her brother Osiris echoed through temple walls and incense-thick chants, and thus, in the candlelit courts of Memphis or Thebes, her body carried not only the blood of gods, but the very structure upon which kingship was legitimized, for no man, no matter how anointed, could sit confidently upon the golden throne, without the stabilizing presence of his sister wife, a woman who anchored his reign to the cosmos, to myth, and to the unbroken chain of royal authority that stretched back to the first breath of creation. And it was this peculiar intertwining of theology and blood that transformed what might otherwise appear as incestuous union into an act of sacred continuity, a necessary repetition of divine precedent, repeated over centuries as though the gods themselves demanded it anew with every rising of the Nile. One must imagine the daily rhythms of such women, not only queens but priestesses, oracles, and vessels of divine presence, as they moved gracefully through the palace gardens or within the colonnaded halls of the harem court, their eyes ringed in kohl, their linen robes whispering against the sandstone floors, their thoughts burdened not with personal longing or maternal dreams, but with the immense weight of ancestral purpose. For from a young age they were taught that their wombs were altars, that their bloodlines were maps upon which the fates of dynasties were drawn, and that in wedding their own brothers, sometimes younger, sometimes older, often both within a lifetime, they were not indulging familial affection or political strategy alone, but obeying an order inscribed in the stars above and the scrolls below, one that asked not for freedom but for flawless repetition, for the reenactment of that divine union that had birthed the very throne on which their lives depended. And the rituals, oh, how slow and hypnotic they must have seemed to the outsider's eye, as incense plumed and harps murmured low melodies into the dusk, while priests murmured blessings over the union of king and queen, who were also brother and sister, crowned not only with jewels but with myth itself, standing before statues of gods that mirror their own configuration. Isis beside Osiris, Nut beside Geb, confirming again and again that this path, though narrow and strange, was sanctioned by the Eternal. And even when the logic frayed, when whispers grew behind stone pillars and murmurs of deformity or madness touched the royal line, still the rhythm continued, as though no storm could halt the sacred song they'd been playing since time itself was new. But even within this dreamlike world of gold and ritual, of braided lineage and temple rites, human emotions, those stubborn echoes of the mortal condition, must have still found quiet corners in which to breathe, and one wonders whether the sister brides ever stood in the cool silence of the Nile's edge just after dusk, gazing at the water and wondering who they might have been had they not been born into such a tightly woven web of ancestry and expectation. If they ever longed for marriage chosen freely, or a love not circumscribed by duty, or perhaps the layers of myth and responsibility were so deeply impressed upon their hearts that they could not imagine any other life than this, a life of ceremonial stillness, of political necessity disguised as divine romance, where motherhood was not personal but dynastic, and where their bodies were marked less by desire than by the demand to preserve and prolong the sacred line, even at the cost of their own identity. And so it continued, through dynasty after dynasty, through times of glory and times of fragmentation, as royal daughters were born already pledged to royal sons, and their futures were shaped not by choice or whim but by scribes, astrologers, and priestly calculations, aligning births and unions to celestial movements, ensuring that the gods would look favorably upon a kingdom whose royal family never allowed their divinity to be diluted by the blood of outsiders. And while this practice may appear to modern minds as tragic or strange, within its own framework it made perfect, unwavering sense, a logic forged not in individual longing, but in sacred tradition, for the ancient Egyptians did not divide the spiritual from the political. They were one and the same, each breath of power echoing from divine lungs, each royal birth a cosmic renewal, each sibling marriage a re-anchoring of divine order to the earth beneath their sandal feet. The grand tombs and hieroglyphs bear witness to this worldview, not as scandal but as scripture, depicting brother kings and sister queens side by side, not in the shadow of shame but beneath the full glow of solar blessing. For these unions were not hidden, not whispered about in corners or concealed behind temple veils, but celebrated in art, carved into stone, painted upon the walls of eternity with care and reverence, suggesting that even if dissent existed, it could not find its voice above the drumbeat of divine precedent, for what the gods had ordained, who among men or women would dare to question. And so, like the steady rise and fall of the Nile, the custom endured, bending through centuries, adapting sometimes but never quite breaking, even as the world around the Nile Valley changed, even as the sands shifted and foreign tongues entered the court, even in the memory of divine blood remained potent, binding brother to sister, king to queen, in ways deeper than the I could see. And so it was that this sacred custom, forged from myth and upheld by ritual, took root so firmly in the royal imagination that a break, it would not simply be rebellion. It would be sacrilege, a sundering of the fragile tether that kept heaven connected to earth and Pharaoh upon his throne. And as each new generation stepped into the golden sandals of divine rulership, they found themselves not only bearing the weight of crowns and scepters, but also inheriting the rituals that bound their flesh and spirit to the practices of those who came before. For the marriage of a pharaoh to his sister was not always driven by desire or affection, but by a far more intricate web of religious preservation and ancestral mimicry, where the patterns of the gods shaped the choices of mortal kings. And those patterns left little room for deviation, without inviting suspicion, scandal, or even cosmic imbalance in the eyes of a deeply pious population. To question such unions in the eyes of the court and priesthood was not merely to challenge the personal will of a ruler. It was to cast doubt upon the order of the world itself, to disturb the Mat, the sacred balance between chaos and harmony that the pharaoh alone was meant to uphold. In temples carved deep with ancient hieroglyphs, the stories of the gods were not distant myths but present truths, echoed in every royal decision. And if Osiris had ruled beside his sister Isis, then surely their children on earth must mirror that sacred partnership, lest the world fall out of rhythm with divine law. And so it was not uncommon for young boys, barely past the innocence of childhood, to be told by their tutors and priests that their destined wives had already been chosen, not from among the court beauties or noble houses, but from within the palace nursery, where their own sisters played in the same sunlit courtyards and bathed in the same perfumed waters, completely unaware that they, too, were being shaped into living goddesses, not by love or freedom, but by generations of unbending, expectation, and theological command. These young girls were trained in grace and silence, in ritual and ceremony, in the art of standing beside a throne without overshadowing it, and in the patient endurance of a role so rigid it left no space for doubt or personal longing. For to be the sister wife of the pharaoh was to be both queen and symbol, not chosen for beauty or wit, but for the sacred blood she carried and the mirror she held up to the heavens. Inside the cool, shaded chambers of the royal harem, beneath ceilings painted with stars and walls scented with myrrh and lotus, mothers whispered these truths into the ears of their daughters, who listened wide-eyed and still, knowing their lives were already written in the sacred scrolls that trace their family's divine lineage. Scrolls older than memory, older than language, older even than the pyramids that stood in silent witness to this unbroken tradition. And while some might have wondered in quiet solitude what life might have been like had they been born into a lesser house, free to marry with a heart led, that wondering rarely rose to the surface. For questioning one's fate was dangerous in a world so carefully balanced between dust and eternity, with the illusion of permanence dependent upon obedience to the ancient ways. To the people beyond the palace walls, the farmers who tilled the black soil of the Nile Valley, the potters who shaped clay into vessels, the merchants who measured silver against grain. These unions were not discussed with scandal or shame, but with a quiet or reserve for celestial things, for they did not view their rulers as men and women in love or duty, but as beings touched by the gods, chosen to preserve the sacred cycle of life and death, flood and harvest, day and night. The pharaoh was a living Horus, son of Isis and Osiris, and as such, his queen must reflect Isis in all her divine purity and loyalty. Not a stranger, not an outsider, but a reflection of his own essence, his equal in blood and power, joined not only in matrimony, but in the eternal drama of divine kingship. And when the rituals of coronation were performed, when the new pharaoh was lifted before the people, crowned with the twin diadems of Upper and Lower Egypt, offered milk and honey in golden vessels, and bathed in sacred oils beside his sister wife, no one spoke aloud the human complications that might have simmered beneath the surface, the awkward silences, the loss of choice, the unspoken tensions of siblings turned spouses. Such things were swallowed by the grandeur of the moment, by the drums and incense, by the chanted prayers and the unwavering gaze of the priests, whose duty was not to comfort the soul, but to maintain the divine order, no matter how heavy the burden became for those who bore it. Even within the inner court, where advisors and scribes knew all the gossip that never reached the outer gates, there was little true dissent against this practice, for it was understood that the bond between pharaoh and sister was not merely a matter of love or blood, but a protective act, a shield against the ambitions of noble families who might, through marriage, try to infiltrate the throne and twist its power toward their own ends. To marry a sister was to close the circle, to guard the royal bloodline against dilution, betrayal, and political manipulation, and in doing so, the pharaoh could rule with fewer threats from rival clans, fewer voices whispering claims to legitimacy in the corners of the palace halls. It was a strategy as much as a sacred rite, a merging of theology and realpolitik in one gilded ritual, and endured for centuries precisely because it served so many masters, gods, priests, rulers, and the fragile myth of divine continuity. And this continuity, once established, became nearly impossible to unthread. For each generation inherited not just a throne, but the decisions of those who came before, and the challenge the custom was to invite unrest, to question one's own lineage, and to admit that perhaps the gods did not smile upon the tradition after all, a risk few dare to take, especially in a land where dynasties rose and fell like the Nile, and where even whispers of change could crumble the foundations of power. By the time Egypt entered its 18th dynasty, the tradition of royal sibling marriage had not merely taken root. It had blossomed into a full, fragrant bloom, sacred and unchallenged, its petals pressed between the pages of both politics and piety, and nowhere was this more vividly embodied than in the life and reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king, who dared to challenge the gods, but not the marriage customs that bound him to his own blood. The royal court under Akhenaten was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. A city of sun worship built from the golden dust of Amarna, populated by hymns and long-limbed statues, where the boundaries between the divine and the human blurred like a dream at dawn, and where, despite his revolutionary monotheism, Akhenaten still clung to practice of marrying within his family, not out of mere habit, but because, even in his sweeping reforms, he understood the power of continuity, the symbolic, armor of tradition, in a kingdom wary of change. It is here, in this strange and luminous court, that we find a young and mysterious Nefertiti, queen consort, perhaps sister, perhaps cousin, her lineage still debated by modern historians, but her role undeniably pivotal in the unfolding drama of power, piety, and royal unity. Whether she was a blood or not, her presence served the same ancient function, to embody the duality of royal femininity and sanctified closeness, a companion to the Sun King whose elongated skull and delicate frame were rendered in carved reliefs as otherworldly, almost androgynous, as though the very shape of the Pharaoh's family sought to reflect the abstract divine. And yet, even amid this ideological upheaval, with temples of Amunias abandoned, with priests cast from their sacred halls, with Aten raised as the singular deity of light, the old tradition of marital bloodlines endured like the bedrock beneath shifting sands. For while Akhenaten may have believed he was chosen by a new god, he still ruled in the shadow of his ancestors, and even revolutionaries, it seemed, needed the illusion of lineage to validate their thrones. But to understand how this fusion of kinship and kingship remained so potent, one must peer not only into the royal bedroom, but into the tombs and temples, the places where memory was carved in stone, and where the past was eternally reenacted in rituals and offerings. For the tombs of Egypt were not simply burial sites. They were living documents, narratives chiseled in meticulous detail along the walls of eternal night, depicting pharaohs and their sisters in poses of divine unity, clasping hands beneath stars, offering fruit to the gods, locked forever in a moment of harmony that transcended mortal life. These images were not decorative flourishes, but assertions of sacred legitimacy, a visual theology that left no room for deviation, and it was through these depictions that the living were reminded, again and again, of their role in the cycle of divine rulership. To step outside this imagery was not simply a break with tradition. It was to sever the lifeline between heaven and earth, to risk becoming not a god-king, but pretender, a mortal, a blasphemer. And so, through century upon century, from the old kingdom to the new, the royal families of Egypt performed this delicate dance of devotion and dynastic preservation, where the line between sacred and secular was as thin as papyrus. Pharaohs took their sisters as queens not only to mimic the gods, not only protect their bloodline from the reach of ambitious courtiers, but because it had become the very grammar of power, an unwritten rule etched into the bones of the nation, understood by priests, peasants, and palace scribes alike. Even in moments of political weakness or foreign invasion, when outside kings threatened the borders or when the Nile ran low and famine whispered through reeds, the marriage between pharaoh and sister remained steadfast, like a lighthouse burning through the storm, assuring the people that the gods still walked among them, that the world was still in order. And beyond the court, In the quiet homes of everyday Egyptians, where clay lamps flicker beside small household shrines, the family remained the most sacred unit, not just for love or comfort, but because it echoed the divine family above. To see Pharaoh join with his sister was not viewed as strange or unnatural, but as an aspirational ideal, a reminder that the family, when pure and whole, was the most potent vessel for continuity and strength. And while commoners did not marry their siblings, indeed, Egyptian law outside the royal sphere strongly discouraged such unions. The symbolic resonance of the practice lingered in lullabies and folk tales, in prayers whispered at childbirth, in the belief that to mirror the divine was to invite harmony into one's life. The palace, distant and gilded, offered a model of the cosmos, and its customs, no matter how insular or foreign they may seem to modern eyes, were believed to ripple outward into the rhythm of everyday life. In truth, it was not biology or desire that lay at the heart of these royal marriages, but mythology, a mythology so potent that it swallowed personal will, so pervasive that it shaped not only the future, but also rewrote the past. Pharaohs did not marry for love, though some might have grown to love. They married for legacy, for symmetry, for the illusion of eternal order in a world prone to chaos. And as long as the stars wheeled above the desert, and as long as the Nile rose and fell in its annual pulse, the people of Egypt believed that the gods still approved, that by marrying sister to brother, queen to king, they were holding the universe in balance, keeping the darkness at bay with a flicker of ritual, with the continuity of blood and crown again. Even the tombs of lesser royals, buried far from the Valley of the Kings, often echoed this belief in their inscriptions, not through active incest, but through the invocation of divine pairings, of names repeated in sacred couplets, of family trees pruned and polished to resemble the mythic lineages of old. To be remembered as close to Pharaoh was to be remembered as close to the gods, and thus even in death, the association with divine kinship remained a currency of power and reverence. And so the tradition, once begun, did not need enforcement. It sustained itself through reverence, through architecture, through stories passed from priest to apprentice, from mother to daughter, until it became indistinguishable from the truth. This was not love as we understand it, nor family as we would shape it, but something deeper and older, a sacred performance etched into the very marrow of a civilization, where the pharaoh, in marrying his sister, did not merely follow a custom, but cast himself into the timeless stage of myth, where every action echoed to the cosmos, and every marriage was a binding of heaven to earth, of yesterday to tomorrow, of the mortal to the divine. And while the mythic symbols and divine doctrine served as the public framework for royal sibling marriage, beneath that gilded layer of godly imagery, another, quieter force stirred in the deep chambers of the palace, one rooted not in temples or scrolls, but in the cold, pragmatic strategies of political survival, where the threads of dynasty, power, and succession were woven together with an almost surgical precision that left little room for emotion, and even less for randomness, for the royal family was not merely a lineage. It was a state itself, and the state demanded order, control, and above all, continuity. In a world where alliances could splinter and noble factions might grow bold in the absence of clear heirs, the pharaohs and their priests, their viziers and scribes, all knew the peril of fractured legitimacy, for history had taught them again and again that when too many hands grasped the throne, Egypt suffered. The gods fell silent, the Nile withheld its blessings, and the common folk, frightened and unsure, turned to whispers and unrest. And so, royal incest became a mechanism of consolidation, a kind of invisible fortress around the seat of power, drawing the circle ever tighter, excluding even powerful noble families from any legitimate claim by blood or marriage. For the king's queen was also his sister, then no other house could claim maternal lineage to the divine ruler. The entire chain of divine inheritance remained locked within the sacred bloodline of the royal house. This approach, while unfathomable to many in later eras, was not born from passion or desire, nor from ignorance or taboo breaking, but from the simple, enduring need to prevent the dilution of sacred and political authority. Marriage, in ancient Egypt, especially among the elite, was seldom about companionship or romance. It was a contract, a calculated alignment of roles and responsibilities, and at the highest level, it was a mechanism of absolute containment, a way to keep the throne untouchable and unshakable, resting always within a bloodline that traced its origins not to the mortal dust of common soil, but to the divine sky, the sun, and the sacred river. If a pharaoh's wife bore him a son, that son would one day rule not only by virtue of his father's crown, but by the purity of his blood. Born of 2 children of Ra, 2 gods made flesh, whose union was both holy and strategically invulnerable to outside claims. And so, the practice continued not merely because it was sacred, but because it worked, because it minimized threats, simplified succession, and eliminated competing dynastic lines before they could form. Even in the rare cases when a pharaoh took a wife from outside his immediate family, perhaps to form an alliance or appease a powerful noble, that wife was almost never granted the title of great royal wife, nor was her child considered equal in legitimacy to those born of the pharaoh's sister or daughter. This rigid hierarchy of birthright became the spine of dynastic rule, reinforced by ritual propaganda and centuries of precedent. In wall carvings and temple paintings, one could often find these sacred unions depicted not with shame or secrecy, but with divine symbolism. The pharaoh and his sister wife standing together beneath the gaze of Hathor, or embraced before the throne of Osiris. Their love framed not as human, but as celestial convergence, a moment where order, harmony, and power all flowed through blood, through womb, through divine will made manifest. And for the common people, far removed from the gilded halls and sunlit altars of the capital, these images served not only as myth, but as instruction, a visual narrative affirming that the ruler was not just appointed by gods, but born from them, again and again, through a sacred cycle maintained by the most ancient and carefully guarded tradition of all. This practice, of course, had consequences that stretched beyond the political sphere and into the quiet shadows of the palace, where generations of closely related unions began to accumulate not just symbolic power, but biological risk, a reality largely unspoken in the public records, but one that modern scholars have traced through the fragments of skeletal remains and the subtle whispers of inherited deformities recorded in late dynastic annals. Still, for the ancient Egyptians, who understood the world not through genes and chromosomes, but through Ma'at and chaos, divine balance and sacred duty, the visible strength of the dynasty, its uninterrupted lineage, its divine aura, its ability to weather civil storms and foreign threats, was proof enough that their path was blessed, that the gods had not abandoned them. And so, the practice endured, often without question, wrapped in the golden language of holiness and the cold necessity of political calculus, until it became so deeply embedded in the heart of pharaonic power that to undo it would have been to unravel the state itself. And yet, even as the sacred marriages unfolded year after year behind the tall palace walls, another pattern was emerging within the court, one quieter, harder to see, but no less significant in the long march of Egyptian history. And yet, even as the sacred marriages unfolded year after year behind the tall palace walls, another pattern was emerging within the court, one quieter, harder to see, but no less significant in the long march of Egyptian history. For while the marriage of royal siblings was meant to preserve the bloodline and secure the throne from external claims, it had a secondary, unintended consequence. It created a court increasingly insular, increasingly isolated, and in time, increasingly fragile not only in body but in thought. The more the pharaohs sought to consolidate power within their own blood, the more they closed themselves off in a vast and complex web of regional alliances, noble loyalties, and local traditions that once held the kingdom together like the interwoven reeds of a papyrus boat drifting down the Nile. The more the royal house looked inward, marrying brother to sister, father to daughter, mother to son, the more it began to resemble a circle drawn so tightly that nothing new could enter. Not new ideas, not fresh alliances, not even a healthy mingling of lineage that had once allowed Egypt's noble houses to knit themselves to the throne through marriage and mutual benefit. In their pursuit of unassailable divinity, the pharaohs built a dynasty of glass, glittering, radiant, and magnificent, but also prone to fracture under the strain of time and human imperfection. Within the palace walls, the echoes of this fragility could be heard not in speeches or scrolls, but in the quiet moments. In the strained gait, a young prince walking the tile floor with twisted legs, in the soft murmurs of physicians summoned in secrecy to treat the mysterious ailments of children born too close in blood, in the heavy silence of a courtier instructed never to speak of the queen's stillborn infant, wrapped in linen and buried before dawn. The royal scribes, ever careful, ever reverent, rarely recorded these whispers, for to do so would be to suggest imperfection in the divine bloodline. But archaeology tells another story, One whispered from the bones of kings whose skulls bore signs of cranial deformation, whose mummified bodies revealed spinal curvatures and joint fusions that spoke not of battle wounds but of inherited disorders. And while not every pharaoh suffered these afflictions, and not every sibling union produced a child with visible defects, the pattern was there, faint, subtle, but undeniable, like a crack in a stone column that slowly deepens with each passing season, unseen until the day it splits wide open beneath the weight of the sun. But physical ailments were only one part of the hidden cost. As the royal family grew increasingly bound to itself, so too did its worldview narrow. Surrounded by advisors selected more for loyalty than merit, protected from criticism by layers of protocol and ritual, the pharaohs and their sister wives began to rule not from a place of responsive wisdom, but from a pedestal raised so high that they could no longer hear the murmurs from the markets, the concerns from the provinces, the rumblings of discontent in the temples and fields. It is no coincidence that some of the more isolated dynasties, those most fervent in their embrace of incestuous succession, also saw the rise of increasingly erratic or ineffectual rulers, men and women so convinced of the divine right that they mistook silence for approval, obedience for devotion, and stagnation for stability. And so, while the official line remained unchanged that the union of brother and sister upheld cosmic order and preserved divine purity, the reality was growing more complex, more precarious, and beneath the golden masks and towering obelisks, Egypt's royal house was slowly folding in upon itself like a lotus whose petals, once open to the sun, had begun to wilt in the stillness of its own reflection. Outside the palace, life went on as it always had. The river rose and fell. The farmers planted their barley and flax. The stonecutters carved names of kings into limestone tombs. But even the common people began to sense the shift, subtle though it was. Where once the pharaoh had walked among them during festivals, now he remained distant, veiled in ceremony. Where once the queen had been the daughter of a noble family, a bridge between the crown and the court, now she was a woman born of the same father, the same house, and shared no bond of the land beyond the palace gates. The stories changed, too. Not the grand myths painted on temple walls, but the whispered tales passed from grandmother to grandchild under starlit skies. Tales of kings too proud, of families too close, of gods who had turned their gaze away. And while none would dare speak against the practice openly, the people, as people always do, began to feel the distance growing between ruler and ruled, between god-king and mortal heart. And within the royal house itself, that distance grew not only outwardly toward the kingdom, but inwardly between its own members. For while the ideal of sibling marriage promised unity, it often bred tension, rivalry, and unspoken grief. A sister who became queen might find herself both wife and political pawn, her loyalty torn between familial duty and personal sorrow. A younger brother, excluded from succession yet sharing the same blood, might nurse ambition that festered in shadow. The children of these unions, born into both privilege and pressure, carried the burden of expectation heavier than any gold collar, expected to be divine yet watched constantly for signs of weakness, illness, or deviation. And so, the cycle fed upon itself, the need to preserve power leading to choices that quietly undermined it, the desire for purity creating vulnerabilities no enemy could exploit because they had already taken root in the throne room itself. And as the years passed and the dynasties turned like the seasons, Egypt would find itself again and again at the mercy of its own design, a kingdom whose rulers, in striving to become gods through sacred blood, sometimes forgot what it meant to be men and women, to listen, to adapt, to reach beyond the known and the safe and the pure. But still, the practice continued, etched in granite, enshrined in papyrus, and woven into the very fabric of kingship. For in the mind of the court, the appearance of continuity was paramount, and if that continuity came at the cost of hidden weakness, then so be it. It was a gamble not of dice, but blood, and Egypt, in all her glory, was willing to play it again and again. And so, as the golden throne aged and the years melted like candle wax under the relentless heat of the Nile sun, the careful cultivation of royal bloodlines took on a ritualized, almost spiritual intensity, weaving itself deeper into the daily rhythm of palace life, until every glance, every decision, and every silence bore the weight of a dynasty's sacred continuity. The pharaoh's court, far from being merely a place of grand announcements and lavish ceremonies, was also a quiet garden of lineage, where sacred unions were planned not in sudden bursts of passion, but in the slow, methodical deliberation of priests, scribes, and advisors who knew that every child bore a royal womb carried within them not only the breath of gods, but also the peril of collapse if their blood were not pure enough to carry forward the celestial flame. It was not merely that pharaohs married their sisters to retain power. It was that the very structure of the world, as they understood it, depended upon that arrangement. To mingle royal blood with the blood of commoners was not only politically risky, it was cosmologically offensive. The sky would not fall, perhaps, and the Nile would still rise with the seasons, but the divine order, the Ma'at, would tremble, and to the ancient Egyptian mind, few things were more dangerous than the trembling of Ma'at. And within this trembling stood the royal family, isolated even from their own nobility, not because they were shunned, but because they had ascended too far above to ever truly return. A pharaoh was not one of the people, not even one of the lords. He was a living Ka, Horus, the falcon-headed god whose eye pierced both the earthly and the eternal. And what woman on earth, save for his own sister who shared his divine essence, could possibly stand beside him as queen and mother of the next god-king? Thus, from early youth, royal siblings were brought up in the quiet choreography of eventual union. They were taught to respect one another, to revere the line they carried, and to prepare their bodies as vessels for the next divine incarnation. Their intimacy was not forged in romance, but in ritual, a kind of sacred closeness that was rehearsed through symbolism and ceremony long before marriage took place. And by the time they reached the age at which their ancestors expected them to join in wedlock, there was already a sacred familiarity between them, an awareness that their purpose had been carved out not by choice, but by ancestry, prophecy, and cosmic law. In private gardens, hidden from the sun by tall stone walls draped in flowering vines, the young royal siblings might walk slowly under the watchful eyes of attendants, speaking softly of dreams, omens, and the weight of expectation. Servants would not speak of what they heard, for silence was as sacred as duty, and any whispered disobedience could unravel not only lives but dynasties. If a brother hesitated or a sister wept, the concern would not be emotional, but political, and priests would consult the gods, asking for guidance not on love, but on the correct alignment of stars and spirits. There was little place for rebellion, not because it was punished swiftly, though it often was, but because there was no conceptual space for it to exist. The pharaohs rule was law, and yet, even as it was bound to the wheel of divine expectation, turning ceaselessly through the sands of time, even the physical design of royal temples reinforced the theme of eternal union. Carvings of brother and sister, husband and wife, king and queen, god and goddess, all stood hand in hand in poses of symmetrical harmony. The great stone images were not designed to flatter, but to represent divine balance, the unity of opposites joined by sacred blood. The goddess Isis stood beside Osiris, her brother and husband, not as a passive figure, but as the force that resurrected and sustained him, just as the queen would sustain the pharaoh, and the sister would give life to the next incarnation of Horus. These were not accidents of myth, but instructions, blueprints etched into the very soul of Egyptian civilization. To step outside this pattern was to invite chaos, and chaos was not tolerated in a world so carefully arranged beneath the gaze of sun gods and death god alike. And though there were whispers in the darker corners of the empire, questions from distant lands, rumors of deformity or madness, or of heirs too weak to rule, those whispers rarely reached the inner halls of the palace. When they did, they were swept away like dust before the coming of the priesthood. The official records would speak only of divine strength, of sacred continuity, of bloodlines untouched by the common world. And if history had to be rewritten to suit this vision, then so be it. The scribes knew their duty as well as the guards, and ink was often more powerful than any sword. In the tombs carved deep into the Valley of the Kings, where eternal silence cradled the resting bodies of ancient rulers, there were no doubts, no confessions, no shame, only the endless, repeating symphony of divine blood and celestial right, etched in hieroglyphs meant to last forever. It is within this echoing stillness that one begins to understand not only why the pharaohs married their sisters, but how deeply that decision was intertwined with their vision of life, death, and the afterlife. It was not an anomaly, not an indulgence, not even a scandal. It was a sacred duty, passed down like a flame through time, illuminating a path where no deviation was allowed and no shadow tolerated. And within that sacred tunnel of tradition, the brother and sister king and queen, walked side by side toward their thrones, their tombs, and their gods. As the centuries drifted onward like lotus petals on the slow-flowing Nile, the divine unions of pharaohs and their sisters became more than just traditions. They became expectations carved into the cultural bones of Egyptian civilization, reaffirmed generation after generation through ritual, art, and architecture. These sacred pairings were not only whispered into the ears of newborn princes and princesses, but were immortalized on colossal temple walls, where every surface echoed with a silent proclamation that the god-king must rule with a consort whose blood was indistinguishable from his own. Inside the soaring hypostyle halls of Karnak and Luxor, shadows fell across engraved depictions of pharaohs standing side by side with their sister queens, each figure draped in flowing garments and immortal stillness, hands extended in offerings to the gods, as if their entire existence served as a bridge between mortal realms and divine eternity. Here in stone, these sibling unions were not scandals to be hidden, but sanctified bonds to be celebrated. And to question them was not merely heretical, it was unthinkable. From a modern perspective, shaped by very different ideas of family, love, and power, these royal practices can feel deeply foreign, even unsettling. But to the ancient Egyptian mind, the logic was pristine and circular. Only someone of the same divine origin could share the throne. Only someone born from the same royal womb could be trusted not to dilute the holiness of the lineage. And only someone whose essence mirrored your own could birth the next link in a chain that stretched back to the gods and forward into eternity. While the outside world, Greece, Mesopotamia, and beyond, might have raised eyebrows or recoiled in confusion, Egypt remained fiercely enclosed, guarded by desert and ritual, its court steeped in layers of cosmic purpose that shielded it from external judgment. The royal family, in its inner chambers and sacred processions, walked a path not of personal desire, but of ancestral duty. Their marriages were not about affection or even lust. They were about balance, order, and divine replication. Each sibling couple became, in essence, a living reenactment of the original divine union, Isis and Osiris reborn with every generation. This reenactment extended far beyond mere symbolism. Entire state ceremonies revolve around affirming and reaffirming the divine couple status. During great festivals such as the Opet or the said festivals, the pharaoh and his queen would be paraded or secretly moved through temple complexes in rituals so ancient that even the priests reciting them no longer fully understood the origin of each word. These were not public spectacles for the amusement of the masses, but solemn affirmations of the pharaoh's continued potency and the cosmic harmony of his union. The queen, in these sacred roles, was not simply his wife but the goddess embodied. She might be Hathor, sweet and fertile, or Sekhmet, fierce and vengeful, depending on the needs of time. Yet behind the masks and titles, she was often unmistakably his sister, a bond made sacred not by secrecy, but by its public, divine acknowledgement. Behind closed doors, the weight of these expectations must have been immense. The pressure upon royal daughters was unlike that faced by any other woman in Egypt. From a moment of birth, a princess of the royal line was groomed not for choice, but for destiny. She was expected to embody purity, grace, and sacredness, not to please a future husband, but to preserve a kingdom's divine mandate. Her body was not her own, but a vessel for the lineage of gods. She would be taught to walk with divine posture, to speak in measured tones, and to serve not only as queen but also as priestess, icon, and symbol. It was her blood, and her blood alone, that could secure the future of Egypt's throne. In this world, freedom and individuality dissolved into duty, and sisterhood became synonymous with sovereignty. These expectations did not disappear in times of crisis. They only intensified. When dynasties faced uncertainty, when succession lines faltered, or when outside forces threatened to intrude upon the purity of the royal house, it was often a sister queen who served as the linchpin of continuity. Some of the most powerful and remembered queens of Egypt, like Ahmose Nefertari, or even Nefertiti, if some theories hold true, were sisters or close blood relatives of the pharaohs they stood beside. Their presence was a reassurance to the people, a visual and symbolic reminder that order still held sway over chaos. They appeared on temple walls not merely as consorts, but as goddesses incarnate, pouring life into the realm through ritual and lineage alike. Their marriages, rather than being hidden, were displayed with grandeur, for they were not transgressions. They were corrections, necessary unions to keep the divine equilibrium intact. It is difficult to imagine the emotional texture of such unions. Did these sibling couples feel love, or longing, or resentment beneath the golden masks of ritual? Were their hearts quiet with duty? Or did they ever rebel in thought if not in action? The records are largely silent. Egyptian scribes were not diarists or novelists. They were archivers of order, inscribing events and names with clarity and reverence, omitting doubt, emotion, or contradiction. If any pharaoh or sister queen suffered under the weight of the sacred mandate, their voices had been swallowed by the sands, their tears dried long before ink could ever record them. But still, one could imagine quiet moments. Soft silences in moonlit chambers where a brother and sister sat side by side, not as gods or monarchs, but as people shaped by expectations greater than themselves, staring across a room heavy with incense and knowing that their union was never truly theirs. And yet, in all their grandeur, these sibling marriages were far from signs of decadence or decline, as some later commentators from foreign lands would suggest. They were, for the ancient Egyptians, a form of spiritual preservation. They were threads in a cosmic loom, each one reinforcing the tapestry of divine kingship. It was a system designed not for individuals, but for eternity in their world. The continuation of divine rule was the highest good, the surest way to keep the Nile flowing, the fields blooming, and the people safe. The pharaoh and his sister queen were not just rulers. They were the living guarantee that the world would not fall apart. And so, in the darkened inner sanctums of ancient temples, where only the highest priests could tread, and where the air shimmered with myrrh in the hush of eternity, the story of sibling marriage played out again and again, not in shame or secrecy, but in ritualized stillness. Stone after stone, wall after wall, century after century, the message remained unchanged. To rule Egypt was to be divine, and to be divine was to marry one's mirror. In that mirror stood a sister, not just of flesh, but of purpose, together, not as lovers or siblings, but as gods reborn. And so, as the sun continued to rise over the golden desert and cast long shadows across the ancient stones, the priests stood in quiet contemplation before the sacred idols in the inner sanctuaries, murmuring incantations older than memory, older even than the names carved in the walls, invoking deities whose stories have been passed down from voice to voice for 1,000 years, their meanings shifting like sand in the wind, yet always returning to the same deep truth, that the union of royal siblings was not merely a political convenience, nor a romantic entanglement, but divine symmetry written into the cosmos itself, a mirror of the heavens embodied in flesh and blood, a reflection of the eternal cycles that govern both Nile and sky. And in this carefully balanced mythology, the pharaoh and his sister wife did not merely rule the land, they sustained it, as Osiris and Isis had once restored the broken world with love, loyalty, and magic older than the stars. This mythic logic, encoded into rituals and retold in temple murals, justified not only the marriages themselves, but the extraordinary authority such unions conferred. For a pharaoh could be Osiris, and his wife Isis, then their very presence in the palace became a ritual reenactment of creation, their every gesture a cosmic echo, and in this way, marriage to a sister was less about the boundaries of the human family, and more about the unbroken line of divine order, a line that must not be, diluted by the chaos of common blood. For to mingle the sacred with the profane would be to risk unraveling the delicate balance upon which all of Egypt rested, and so these unions were preserved year after year, dynasty after dynasty, a solemn duty cloaked in gold and silence. Yet while these stories gave the practice its sacred sheen, they also served a more pragmatic function that rarely made its way into official texts. For within the corridors of the royal house, where ambition lingered behind smiles and loyalty could change with the tide, marrying a sister did more than please the gods. It fortified the throne itself, sealing off threats from outside families, preventing power from seeping through marriage alliances that might one day bear rivals with acclaim. To rule. And so, beneath the surface of divine narrative, there existed a world of calculation, of whispered fears and ancestral caution, where every union was a shield as well as a symbol, where a sister was trusted not only because she was kin, but because she carried the same bloodline, the same ambitions, the same incentive to guard the throne from outsiders. Still, even among those who accepted the divine rationale and understood the political calculus, there remained unease, rarely spoken but sometimes captured in fragments. in the poetry that hinted at unspoken sorrow, in the laments of court musicians who strummed soft chords in candlelit halls and sang of love restrained, of duty that suffocated joy, of women who looked out at the river in silence, their faces unreadable beneath gilded veils, wondering whether the gods had indeed chosen this path, or whether the gods themselves were only reflections of kings, mirrors made of stone and story, reflecting not heaven, but the will of men too powerful to be questioned. For not every sister who wore the crown beside her brother had dreamed of it. Some had played as children in the palace gardens, free beneath the date palms, only to find their fate sealed before their hearts had even begun to form their own desires. And while the annals of history preserved their names in lines of hieroglyphs, and the statues captured their features in serene perfection, the truth of their lives remained hidden, guarded behind closed doors, and wrapped in layers of ceremonial stillness. Their joys and sorrows whispered only to trusted servants, or perhaps never spoken aloud at all, swallowed like the silence that filled the great halls between festivals, when the music had faded and the incense burned low, and the weight of the crown pressed down on young brows, still learning how to smile for the gods. And it is in this silence that we begin to glimpse the human cost of tradition, the quiet ache beneath the golden ritual, the moments between the ceremony and the myth, when a sister and brother, bound not by affection but by destiny, looked at each other across a cold stone chamber and realized that their lives had ceased to be their own, that they were not merely rulers but symbols, not lovers but instruments, shaped by generations of belief and preserved by the hands of scribes who would never write of their fears, their doubts, their longing for something beyond the eternal reenactment of the story they had no choice but to perform. And though their faces remain immortalized in reliefs and painted tombs, it is their silences that echo loudest across the centuries, a hush that lingers in the empty corridors of forgotten palaces, waiting patiently for someone to listen. And so the cycle continued. Even as dynasties fell and new rulers rose to claim the divine lineage, each inheriting not only the throne but the quiet burden of maintaining the sacred union, a burden passed from generation to generation like a hidden inheritance, cloaked in ritual, guarded by priests, and wrapped in the same myth that had once comforted the earliest kings beneath the watchful gaze of Ra. And now, as the breeze from the Nile drifts gently through the reed-framed temple courtyards, stirring the incense smoke into slow spirals that rise like ghostly vines toward the open sky, we drift deeper still into the vast and sacred logic that once bound blood to blood and throne to divinity, where the repetition of ritual was not merely tradition, but a defense against the very forces of disorder, of entropy, of time's slow unraveling. For the minds of the ancient Egyptian elite, the world was constantly at risk of collapse, its harmony fragile, its stability dependent not on swords or armies, but on Ma'at, the divine order of truth, balance, and cosmic justice, and to violate that order, even in something as seemingly intimate as whom a king chose to marry, was to invite the chaos of Isfet, that terrible opposite of harmony, a darkness that had no shape, no form, only destruction. It was this fear of Isfet, of disorder, foreignness, rebellion, and rot, that haunted the dreams of priests and pharaoh alike in their vast mythological imagination. There was no greater protection against that creeping chaos than precise, eternal reenactment of divine precedent, of cosmic first acts that took place not in time but in eternity. And so, when a pharaoh married his sister, it was not seen as a new union, but as a continuation of the first and only sacred marriage, that of Isis and Osiris, divine siblings, eternal lovers, the model upon which all sacred kinship was based, their story so deeply woven into the cultural imagination that every royal couple echoed their example, not merely in name or symbolism, but in ceremonial repetition, as though by acting out again and again, the cosmos itself could be kept from slipping into ruin. Thus, when the high priest anointed a sister as queen, they were not bestowing an honor so much as preserving a thread of sacred continuity that reached back to the first moment of divine time, the Zep Tepi, when the gods had walked among men and the world had been set in its perfect shape, and every pharaoh since had been charged not with innovation, but with preservation, with maintaining the stillness of divine order in a world that endlessly moved. And to preserve that stillness, the royal bloodline must remain whole, untouched by the randomness of outer families, of distant loyalties, of political marriages that might weaken the sacred line with the uncertainties of external ambition. This was not merely superstition. It was cosmology, metaphysics, the architecture of meaning upon which the entire Egyptian worldview was built. And within this worldview, marriage between siblings in the royal house was not considered perverse or unnatural, but necessary, an act of restoration rather than deviation, a return to the original divine balance that had first shaped the heavens and earth. And to question, it was to question the very nature of the king's divinity, the legitimacy of his rule and the survival of Egypt itself. And so, silence and reverence surrounded these unions, protected by ritual and myth, guarded by priests, etched in stone with hieroglyphs that told the story not of a marriage, but a cosmic joining, a renewal of sacred order. The temples themselves reflected this worldview, with their walls carved not just with depictions of gods and offerings, but with intricate genealogies that tied each reigning pharaoh to the divine lineage. And when a sister became queen, her name was added with ceremony, as both consort and goddess, an embodiment of Hathor of Isis, of Mater self, her role not passive but potent, for in the royal court, women of the bloodline held a mysterious and often veiled power, their influence less visible than that of warriors or scribes, but no less real, their voices carried through the whispers of priestesses, through the management of temple properties, through the teaching of children who would one day rule, and through the very presence they held in palace rituals, where their faces were masked in serenity, and their hands moved with the precision of a lineage practiced over centuries. And in this arrangement, one can begin to see a profound difference between the values of ancient Egypt and those of later societies. For in most later civilizations, marrying a sister would be a scandal, a violation of taboo, a breach of moral law. But in ancient Egypt, it was seen as the very opposite, a stabilizing act, an affirmation of sacred continuity, a protection against the chaos that lurked just beyond the desert's edge. And even though not every pharaoh took a sister as wife, those who did were seen as aligning themselves more closely with the divine, taking on the burden and privilege of mimicking the gods in every aspect of their rule, and reinforcing the sacred pattern that gave Egypt its strength. This belief system was not universally shared. Even in ancient times, foreigners, particularly Greeks and later Romans, looked upon these royal marriages with confusion or revulsion, unable to see the mythic logic beneath the union, focusing instead on what they perceived as biological or ethical concerns, but for the Egyptians themselves, raised on temple hymns and cosmic cycles. Such objections must have seemed not only ignorant, but dangerous, the kind of thinking that eroded the foundations of sacred kingship and opened the door to foreign influence, rebellion, and disorder. And so, the marriage of royal siblings continued, defended not just with myth but with power, wrapped in silence, shrouded in gold. And as centuries passed and dynasties rose and fell and the gods themselves began to fade into memory, the statues of these sister queens remained, eyes gazing outward in polished stone, smiles frozen in eternal calm, their names preserved on temple lintels and burial goods, even as the reasons for their union slowly dissolved into the mist of forgotten beliefs. Yet the echoes remain, carried in the sands that shift gently over the ruins, in the faded lines of murals where royal couples sit hand in hand beneath the stars, and in the hearts of those who still wander the ancient halls of Karnak and Luxor and wonder what secrets the statues guard, what stories they would whisper, if only the world were quiet enough to listen once again. And though the sacredness of bloodlines had long been a guiding principle among the elite, it was in the later dynasties that the consequences of this closed circle of marriage began to echo more visibly in the bodies of those born from it. For nature, unlike gods and priests, could not be persuaded by myth or custom, and while lineage might be preserved on parchment and temple wall, the frailty of bone and the clouding of mind could not be so easily hidden behind golden masks or carved declarations of divine favor. In the twilight centuries of Egypt's long and restless history, the royal tombs of children who never saw adulthood and kings who limped, coughed, and ruled briefly became silent testaments to a system cracking under its own reverence for blood, a devotion so unyielding that it denied itself the possibility of fresh roots, choosing instead to coil inward like a serpent chasing its own tail. The mortuary records, when sifted through by the patient hands of modern archaeologists, reveal a pattern both heartbreaking and predictable. Stillborn infants, teenage mummies with malformed limbs, skulls too thin to protect a growing brain, and generations of rulers whose lives were brief and burdened, weighed down not just by the crowns they wore, but by the legacies written into their very bones. Among them, one name rises with haunting familiarity, a boy whose mask became the most recognized image of ancient majesty, and whose brief life offers a quiet glimpse into the toll exacted by the practices of royal incest. Tutankhamun, the boy king whose golden-faced mask now gazes timelessly from behind museum glass, was born of a family that had, for generations, turned inward, cousin marrying cousin, sibling joining sibling, until the tree of ancestry became less a branching network and more a closed loop, repeating names, features, and weaknesses over and over like a chant with no end. When his tomb was unearthed in 1922 by Howard Carter, it was hailed as the most significant archaeological find of the modern era, and while the treasures within dazzle the world, the body lying beneath the gold offered different kinds of truths. One's not opulence or ritual, but pain, fragility, and genetic decline. Tutankhamun's body, when studied with the tools of science rather than the awe of mythology, revealed a litany of ailments: a cleft palate, a curved spine, a clubfoot that left him walking with cane, and evidence of necrosis in the bones of his left foot, suggesting he lived in constant pain. Genetic studies later confirmed what many suspected, that his parents were full siblings, an arrangement that might have pleased the gods and soothed the concerns of priests, but did little to ensure the strength or longevity of their heir. He died around the age of 19, perhaps from complications due to malaria or an infective fracture, but beneath the speculation lies a deeper tragedy, that in their relentless quest to maintain purity and divine resemblance, the pharaohs had slowly eroded the very foundations upon which their legacy rested. And yet, despite the mounting costs, the tradition persisted, because its roots were not only in superstition or pride, but in a deeper fear, a fear of dilution, of chaos, of the unfamiliar threading its way into the fabric of a dynasty that claimed direct descent from the gods themselves. In their eyes, the divine was not to be mingled with the common, and every marriage outside the sacred bloodline was a threat, a fracture in the symbolic mirror they held to the heavens. Even in decline, even as Nubian forces pressing from the south and foreign dynasties rose and fell, the ritual of consanguineous union clung tightly to the throne, like ivy on crumbling stone, no longer offering strength, but difficult to untangle without tearing the structure apart. The temples still echoed with chants of divine birth, and the walls continued to show the eternal embrace of brother and sister under the approving gaze of the sun god Ra. But in the quiet corridors of the palaces, behind the opulent facade, the human cost whispered a different story, one of loneliness, physical frailty, and dynasties unraveling not with war, but from within. And as the priests muttered prayers and scribes copied genealogies with careful hands, the bodies of those born from these unions lay wrapped in linen and silence, their bones telling tales that no incantation could hide. The gods may have demanded purity, but they offered no protection from the laws of the natural world. And as time wore on, Egypt's ruling line began to look less like an image of divine perfection, and more like a warning etched into history's long and winding scroll. Still, the symbols held fast. For symbols, unlike people, do not suffer under their own weight. The ankh, the crook and flail, the serpent crown, all retained their luster even as the flesh beneath them faltered. And so the stories endured, not just because they were beautiful or powerful, but because they were necessary. The illusion of unbroken divine rule was the glue holding a brittle structure together, and to question its practices, to wonder aloud whether the gods approved of such unions, or whether they perhaps looked away in sorrow, was a danger few dared approach. The mythology was airtight, its logic circular and self-reinforcing, and in a world where writing was sacred and words were binding, to record a doubt was to conjure a threat. It was better, perhaps, to remain silent, to let the cycle repeat, to believe that the gods, who created the Nile and the stars and the heartbeat of the kingdom, would somehow make it all right in the end. And so generation followed generation, and kings were born, crowned, and buried, some strong and many not, their blood growing ever thinner even as their divine status remained unchanged. The people, for their part, continued to offer prayers and offerings, for faith is not always rooted in truth, but often in need. And the need for order, for meaning, for a cosmos with clear lines and sacred rules, ran deeper than any single king or queen. And as the sun rose each day over the shifting dunes and the blue-green waters of the Nile, the ancient cycle continued, of harvest and flood, of birth and burial, of gods and mortals tangled together in stories both beautiful and sorrowful, told again and again until even their echoes grew tired. And as the rhythm of ritual tightened its hold on a royal household, there arose another layer to the practice that few outside the palace walls could comprehend, a reason buried not in bloodlines or the whims of gods, but in the shifting sands of political necessity. For while myth and divinity gave the practice its sacred veil, it was a pragmatic structure of dynastic power that sustained it, like a scaffolding propping up an ever-fragile throne, because within the ebb and flow of Egypt's long dynasties, the pharaoh's grasp on power often depended not just on armies or temples, but on keeping control of inheritance, land, loyalty, and above all, legitimacy. And in a land where names and bloodlines were as heavy as stone, marrying one sister ensured that all power remained undiluted within the tightest circle of the royal line, a practice not of affection, but a consolidation, not a desire, but a containment, as if by binding brother and sister, the kingdom itself might be, tied in a not so strong it could not be unraveled by rival clans, distant cousins, or ambitious priests. For Egypt, unlike many of its neighbors, did not operate on the basis of broad aristocratic families vying for rule, but on the enduring image of a single divine house, and so to prevent the slow seepage of authority into too many hands, royal unions became more than ceremonial. They became fortresses, protecting the very core of pharaonic identity, because to marry outside the bloodline, even to a noble woman, was to open a door, however slightly, to new influences, new claims, and new centers of gravity within the court, while a union between royal siblings created not only heirs but also locked the circle of succession into itself, forming an unbroken loop where the throne could be passed without contest or confusion, a closed system in which the queen was already part of the divine lineage and needed no introduction to its rights or secrets. And it was not just a theoretical concern, for history offered pharaohs chilling examples of what could happen when succession passed into the hands of those deemed only half royal or descended from lesser lines. For whispers of unrest, rebellion, and court intrigue often followed such deviations. And so as centuries turned and thrones rose and fell, the instinct to keep things in the family deepened, calcifying into a tradition that was no longer questioned but simply reenacted, like a performance passed from one generation of gods to the next. And in this way, brother-sister marriages became less a choice and more a necessity, a ritual choreography that held the palace together with golden threads of shared birth. Even the great rulers whose names endure in modern memory, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, Cleopatra, did not depart from this ancestral dance. For do so would have been a step beyond the roles laid out in the sacred script, and though historians today speak of power and incest and the dangers of inbreeding, those within the palace would have spoken only of order, of duty, of preserving Ma'at, the great cosmic balance that held Egypt together, from the quiet shores of the Nile to the storm-tossed gates of the underworld. And so each union was, in a sense, a sacrifice, not of blood on an altar, but freedom in the name of function, a personal life given over to the larger machinery of dynasty, where a pharaoh and his sister might sit together beneath the lotus-fringed columns, not in passion or romance, but in shared awareness of the burden they both carried, knowing that in joining, they weren't merely affirming each other, they were affirming the kingdom itself, binding it once again in sacred flesh, so that no rival voice could rise from outside, no foreign queen could sway the court, and no faction could claim that the child who came next was anything less than the very image of divinity incarnate. And yet, beneath this cold logic and sacred solemnity, there remained quiet human truths, subtle and unspoken. For not all siblings were equals in mind or spirit. Not all marriages were smooth or untroubled, and in that golden prison of divine obligation, there were likely tensions no scroll recorded, feelings never carved into temple walls, and resentments buried far deeper than any tomb. And within the hallowed chambers of the royal compound, where incense wafted through shadowed halls and the painted gods gazed eternally from sandstone walls, there emerged a quiet but deeply consequential effect of this marriage practice, one that rarely echoed in official decrees or hymns of praise, yet shaped the destiny of the dynasty just as surely as river or stone, the subtle, creeping toll of inbreeding, that ancient hazard whispered of only in hindsight, its symptoms buried beneath, crowns and titles, its consequences sometimes masked by the splendor of the throne. For while the union of brother and sister might preserve the appearance of divine continuity, it also narrowed the gene pool so perilously that fragile children began to emerge from these gilded wombs, bearing within the hidden cost of such an insular lineage. And this truth, this unsettling consequence, was not entirely invisible to the ancients, though they lacked the language of modern genetics or the clarity of empirical science. For patterns were seen, if not spoken aloud, among midwives and servants and scribes who attended the royal births, those who cleaned the blood and swallowed the infants and knew which ones thrived and which did not. And though pharaohs were gods, even gods were not immune to frailty, and so among these divine heirs we find echoes of suffering, children born with deformities or with weakness in bone or limb, or minds that never quite grasped the reins of empire. And though such stories were rarely recorded in stone, they linger in the artifacts left behind, in mummies with twisted spines or skulls oddly shaped, in bones that hint at clubfoot or cleft palate, or the unmistakable signs of genetic disorders passed silently down generations. One of the most compelling examples rests in the fragile remains of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose golden mask is known the world over, and yet beneath that flawless visage lay a body shaped by the narrowing of his ancestral tree. For CT scans and DNA analysis suggest he suffered from congenital problems, a clubfoot, a curved spine, and likely a weakened immune system. And his parents, it turns out, were almost certainly brother and sister, their union mirroring that ancient custom which, in its quest to preserve holiness, inadvertently weakened the very vessel meant to carry it forward. And though his tomb was rich beyond imagination, his reign was short, his body frail, and his legacy more cautionary than triumphant. But it was not only the physical form that bore the burden of these unions. It was also the capacity to govern, for inbreeding, especially when repeated over generations, can sometimes cloud not only the body but the mind, dulling the instincts needed for strategy, diplomacy, and wisdom. And in a court where sycophants surrounded the throne and only lineage determined succession, a pharaoh unfit to rule could still ascend the steps of the palace, could still wear the crown of upper and lower Egypt, even if he could not wield it with strength or clarity. And so, we must imagine not only the divine ceremony of these sibling marriages, not only the golden light of temples and the chants of priests, but also the quiet unease that may have settled among royal physicians, the nervous glances of advisors who saw in each new era hope shadowed by uncertainty, for they could not speak openly of such matters, could not question the will of the gods or the purity of the bloodline, but in their silence, in the careful way they wrote names or avoided certain records, there is a ghostly trace of concern, as if they sensed the cost of this divine isolation, but knew they were powerless to stop it. And yet the practice continued, not out of blindness, but because the perceived benefits still outweighed the risks in the minds of those who ruled, because the pharaoh's legitimacy mattered more than his health, and a throne held by a divine invalid was still preferable to one contested by a healthy outsider. And so the cycle turned on, generation after generation, each marriage a gamble cloaked in ritual, each heir a vessel both sacred and uncertain, and beneath the timeless pyramids, history's great experiment in dynastic purity unfolded with quiet, tragic dignity. As the Nile flowed on, uncaring and eternal, the people continued to offer prayers for their rulers' health and strength, unaware that within the great palaces of Memphis and Thebes, the very blood that linked their gods was also weakening them, slowly, irrevocably, like gold that gleams brightly even as it cracks beneath the surface. And as centuries folded gently into one another like the layers of linen wrapped around the sacred dead, the inner workings of the palace, its customs, its expectations, its quiet burdens, gave rise to an unspoken truth that echoed through the shadowy corridors of royal life, that princesses born into the house of the pharaoh were not daughters in the usual sense, not girls free to dream of distant lands or romantic adventures or husbands chosen from among noble families, but rather instruments of dynastic preservation, living vessels for divine legacy, raised from infancy with the understanding, subtle at first, then firm, that their fate was not to leave the palace, but to become one with it, not to marry into foreign courts, but to remain within the sacred walls, often chosen, sometimes expected, to become the wife of their own brother, as tradition demanded, as divinity required, and as the state silently insisted. And so these royal women, draped in white linen and perfumed with myrrh and lotus oil, were educated not only in the ways of the gods, but in the delicate choreography of dynastic loyalty, taught from childhood how to speak with solemnity, how to walk with grace through the temple precincts, how to recite hymns before the statues of Ammonius and Osiris, but also how to accept the invisible chains that would bind them not to a partner of affection, but to a throne of stone, for while the world outside might view them as princesses of enviable power, within the gilded cage of the palace they were rarely free, and their value lay not in choice but in continuity, not in romance but in ritual. And this ritual, passed down like a golden scepter through generations, often veiled a human cost beneath its grandeur. Those young women who, while publicly celebrated as a great royal wife, privately bore away a role they never sought, whose hearts may have yearned elsewhere, or perhaps nowhere at all, for in a world where marriage was less a union of souls and more a geometric strategy of lineage, affection could seem irrelevant, and love was often a casualty left unspoken in the pages of royal annals, overshadowed by processions, coronations, and births catalogued more for their political meaning than for any joy they might bring. And so a sister might become a wife, and that wife a mother, and that mother the queen of Egypt, honored in murals and immortalized in limestone, yet never truly remembered as a woman, who might have longed for a different path, who might have wondered what life lay beyond the palace gates, or what kindness might feel like without duty shaping its every breath. And though the statues erected in her honor bore inscriptions of divine unity and sacred bloodlines, none spoke of the quiet hours, the lonely nights, the moments between ceremonies when the golden mask slipped, and a girl raised to be a goddess might glimpse the simple sorrow of being human. And among the whispers of servants, the murmurs of handmaidens who saw more than the hieroglyphs reveal, there lived stories that were never etched into stone. Stories of sisters who hesitated at the altar, of queens who bore children they did not want, of young girls prepared for marriage at ages far too tender, and of mothers who watched their daughters inherit the same unyielding fate, generation after generation. The ritual renewing itself like the floodwaters of the Nile, beautiful, inevitable, and sometimes cruel. But these women endured, as the Pharaohs did, not because they were without sorrow, but because the survival of the divine order depended upon their silence, their compliance, their ability to embody both royalty and restraint. And in doing so, they became pillars of the Egyptian state, not just the blood they passed on, but through the sacrifice they made of their own autonomy, their own desires, their own right to different life, a sacrifice rarely spoken of, yet etched into the very foundations of Egypt's mythic eternity. And in the end, while the names of these royal daughters turned wives are carved into monuments and whispered in prayers to the gods, the true weight of their role remains hidden in the silence between the lines, in the empty spaces of history, where no scribe dared to write that the throne, for all its splendor, was not only made of gold and cedar, but also of quiet sorrow and lives reshaped by duty disguised as divinity. And as the generations flowed onward like the slow and silent drift of the Nile beneath a harvest moon, the perception of this royal incest, so often shocking to modern eyes, became not merely tolerated but sanctified, elevated beyond the realm of human critique into the sacred canopy of divine precedent. For in the minds of priests and scribes who guarded the ideologies of power, it was not simply an arrangement of blood and lineage, but a reenactment of the sacred myths themselves, echoes of Isis and Osiris, the most divine pair, siblings and lovers, whose celestial union birthed Horus, the falcon god and eternal protector of the two lands, and in that myth lay justification, symbolism, and permanence, transforming what in other cultures might have been condemned into something sacrosanct, beyond questioning, draped in the incense and gold of holy repetition. And so, the royal court, already a place of impossible wealth and careful ritual, became the theater upon which myth and reality blurred like ink in the floodwaters of a scribe's ruined scroll, where each royal wedding, when the sister joined her brother upon the throne, became not only a political necessity, but a cosmic performance, reaffirming the eternal balance of Ma'at, the divine order of the universe, through which Egypt thrived and endured. And to question such a union would not be to critique mere mortal choices, but to disturb the alignment of gods and creation itself, a blasphemy few dared even whisper within the temple's hallowed chambers. And while foreign emissaries and travelers, scribes from Hutti, merchants from Byblos, ambassadors from Assyria, may have blinked with confusion at these customs, veiling their judgment behind polite nods and diplomatic silence, within Egypt the practice held no such controversy, for it was a way of things, as natural as the rising of Ra each morning or the flooding of the Nile each year. And those born into House of Pharaoh understood from the earliest cradle lullabies that their lives were not their own, that each gesture, each betrothal, Each child born beneath the painted ceiling of the palace nursery was part of sacred script written long before their birth by gods whose voices now spoke through priests, dreams, and the movements of stars. And if there were moments of private doubt, of hidden sorrow or quiet rebellion, they are lost to us now, for history, so often written by those who served the throne, rarely recorded the pain beneath perfection, the hesitation behind the ceremonial smile, and thus the mythology grew like ivy upon stone, covering truth with symbol, obscuring flesh beneath deity, until even the participants themselves perhaps believed in the inevitability of it all, believed that to marry one's sister was not a burden, but a divine privilege, a sacred echo of the heavens, and that their bloodline was not merely noble, but celestial, as untouchable and incorruptible as the stars over Thebes. And in temples carved with columns of lotus and papyrus, priests chanted these unions as renewals of the cosmos, painting the joining of siblings not as human impulse, but as ritual necessity, an echo of the first creation when the world emerged from chaos, and the gods, alone in the dark, had only each other. And in that memory, true or not, was born a belief that a pure line meant a powerful line, that by closing the blood circle, the pharaoh was not weakening his line with deformity or decay, as later science might suggest, but strengthening his divine aura, reinforcing the luminous thread that tied him back to Ra, to Horus, to beginning of time. And so, beneath these beliefs, the royal marriages became spectacles of reverence, complete with golden crowns, chanted hymns, and processions under banners fluttering like birds in a breeze, where even the people, who rarely glimpsed the private lives of the pharaohs, would cheer and praise the union, not as gossip or scandal, but as the rightful course of things, a divine celebration whose grandeur reminded them that their king was not like them, was above them, chosen not by men but by gods, and thus lived by rules no mortal could challenge without tipping the fragile scales of harmony into chaos. And in this way, the myth became the law, and the law became the expectation, until each generation of rulers and ruled alike accepted the pattern as timeless, unbroken, as inevitable as the Nile's retreat and return, and though beyond the desert's edge other kingdoms mocked or questioned, Egypt held firm in its sanctified isolation, guarded by its rituals, protected by its stories, wrapped in its own ancient dream where brother and sister could become king and queen, god and goddess, flesh and symbol all in one. And in the dim quiet of the palace corridors, where the walls bore paintings older than any living soul and the scent of cedar lingered from ancient shipments long decayed, the children born of these divine unions came into the world already burdened with expectation. For they were not merely heirs in a worldly sense, destined to rule over fields, fortresses, and taxation registers. They were living embodiments of a cosmic cycle, flesh and blood continuations of celestial marriages meant to preserve the balance of existence itself. And so their births were celebrated with a hush of reverent or rather than ordinary joy, their cradles gilded not only in gold but in prophecy, and their futures lay before them as straight and narrow as the roads between the great temple pylons. For deviation was unthinkable in a world where every breath of royalty was entwined with myth, every smile an echo of divinity, and yet, behind the perfumed veils and silken wrappings, there may have existed a quieter, more human truth, one that seldom survived in the triumphal stele or temple inscriptions, yet which perhaps whispered itself in the eyes of stone statues and a half-faded ink of forgotten papyri. The truth that blood, when bound too tightly, begins to turn inward, consuming itself in a silent erosion of vitality masked by ceremony and soothed by repetition. And so it was that as the dynasties progressed, especially in the twilight centuries, when Egypt's grandeur, though still monumental, began to fray at the edges, the cost of such isolation within the royal blood became harder to ignore, even in a society that preferred myth over medicine. And physicians, though limited in both knowledge and scope, began to see with quiet dread the patterns forming behind the palace walls. Patterns of stillbirths, of fragile limbs, of twisted spines hidden behind, embroidered cloaks, of minds that did not bloom like lotus, but wither before the sun had properly risen, and though no one would dare speak the word inbreeding, as we know it today, the hushed warnings carried behind fans and whisper in alcoves told a line that, while divine in claim, was weakening with every generation, thinning like a river cut off from its source, its once mighty current slowed to a trickle by the narrowing path of inherited flaw. And among the elite, those who attended court regularly and whose fortunes were tied to proximity with the throne. Rumors circulated like the desert wind, ungraspable, shifting, but ever-present, of pharaohs who struggled with speech, of queens whose wombs bore only sorrow, of sons who could not stand beneath the weight of their crowns. And though the official records praise their piety and wisdom, etched their names into eternity with grand declarations of victories and divine favor, the reality behind the facade may have been more fragile, more mortal, as the cost of centuries of divine marriages, intended to preserve the purity of the royal house, began to manifest not as divine power but as frailty, the hidden toll of a tradition wrapped in gold but rooted in isolation. For even the gods, it seems, could not halt the consequences of biology forever. And yet the machinery of belief rolled on, unmoved by suffering, because the narrative could not bend to accommodate flaw. For do so would unravel everything: the temples, the priesthood, the justification of royal taxes and monumental building projects, the entire scaffold state authority that rested on the divinity of the pharaoh. And so these physical and mental weaknesses were hidden or reframed, sometimes reimagined as signs of spiritual otherness, of mystical insight or divine, distance from the ordinary human experience. And thus the narrative adapted itself, as myths often do, to suit the crumbling facts, creating new layers of holiness around what might have been, in another world, symptoms of a genetic bottleneck. And in this way, the royal house remained both exalted and trapped, unable to break free from the very mythology that gave it power, locked in a cycle of sibling unions not by desire, but by design, until the lineage became a loop and the loop a noose, slowly tightening across the centuries. And in one of history's most poignant ironies, the very purity so obsessively guarded, the divine flame believed to burn brightest in undiluted blood, became the cause of dimming. For in seeking to remain above the common world, the pharaohs had turned inward, severing the healthy veins of possibility that might have flowed from wider unions. And as their blood thickened with repetition, the empire itself began to suffer. Advisors grew bolder, foreign powers more intrusive, and the once flawless image of the god-king began to flicker, challenged not openly, but through erosion, through whispers, attrition, and quiet revolts that hinted at a growing awareness that something, deep within the heart of the throne, was amiss, something that no amount of ritual or offering could quite set right again. And still, they clung to the old ways, not because they worked, but because they had always worked, or so they believed. For tradition in Egypt was not merely a cultural feature, but a cosmic imperative, a stabilizing force that weathered plagues, invasions, famines, and floods, and to abandon it, especially now, would feel like heresy, like a betrayal of gods and ancestors alike. And so even as the cracks deepened, as the heirs grew fewer and frilier, as the divine sons of Ra began to resemble less the gods and more the broken reflections of a fading dynasty, the court continued the ancient marriages, continued the pageants and prayers, continued to believe, or at least to pretend to believe, that the sacred union of brother and sister was still a fountain of strength, rather than the slow poison of a system too sacred to change. And thus, the children of these marriages, some bright, some dim, some destined to rule and others hidden away in silken shadows, became living metaphors for a kingdom as twilight, splendid on the surface, hollow at the core, glittering with gold yet trembling beneath the weight of its own mythology, for they carried not only the blood of their parents, but the accumulated legacy of centuries, a legacy that had once unified a people and held back chaos, but which now teetered on the edge of collapse, too rigid to adapt, too sacred to discard. And in their eyes, if one would look closely enough, perhaps there flickered not the fire of divine inheritance, but the quiet confusion of children caught between legend and reality, born into a lineage that demanded perfection but offered only repetition, ceremony, and the cold embrace of expectation. And somewhere deep in the palace archives, perhaps in a scroll half burned by time or buried beneath layers of more convenient records, might exist the names of those children, unfit for rule, unmentioned in the list of kings, yet born of the same sacred unions. Their stories untold but no less real, hidden by the same silence that always falls upon uncomfortable truths, a silence heavier than stone and older than the pyramids themselves. And in that silence lies the final legacy of royal sibling marriage. Not grandeur, not divinity, but the quiet cost preserving an illusion too powerful to question, even as it quietly crumbled beneath its own weight. And so the slow unfolding of dynastic custom entered an even darker chamber of memory, a space no longer lit by divine promise or mythic order, but one flickering faintly with the ghostly reflections of those whose lives were sealed by the binding chains of royal expectation. For by now, the late dynasties had grown accustomed to the intricate cage they themselves had forged, a cage gilded in the richest gold, but a prison nonetheless, and within its mirrored walls the children of gods and queens were raised not for freedom, not even for love, but only for preservation of something that had long since lost its clarity of purpose. And it was in this fog of tradition and pride that young princes were promised to sisters they barely knew. Daughters were prepared from infancy for the day they would lie beside a brother they had never chosen. And all of it was sanctified not by joy but by history, and the cold, unyielding decree of what must be, what always was, and what always would be. And as scribes faithfully etched names into stone and priests murmured blessings drawn from the oldest texts, the human hearts of those within the royal house began to beat more quietly, subdued not only by their duty, but by the weariness that comes from generations of repetition, a weariness that whispered, gently but firmly, that this was simply how the world worked for those born beneath the crown. In the hushed stillness of temple courtyards, where lotuses floated in ornamental pools and incense curled like memory toward the evening sky, one could sometimes hear the faintest murmurs, the quiet questions of those not meant to question. Young women whose eyes had wandered beyond the palace walls, young men who felt something stir in their chests when they glimpsed a servant girl or a foreign visitor. Moments so fleeting and forbidden they dissolved as soon as they were felt. Yet even these whispers of longing were not enough to shake the heavy structure that surrounded them, for within that ancient scaffolding, carved into limestone and enforced by silence, the marriage of Pharaoh to his sister had become not merely acceptable, but inevitable. And in that inevitability, the passage of time grew thick and unmoving, like the slow build-up of desert dust upon the threshold of a forgotten shrine, until generation after generation slipped into one another, nearly indistinguishable in their fates and footsteps, like carved reliefs marching endlessly across the walls of eternity. And yet, even in this echoing chamber of repeated lives, the pressures of the outside world continued to knock, softly at first, then with growing insistence, as foreign lands grew bolder and internal divisions more pronounced, and Egypt, once wrapped tightly in its own mythic self-assurance, began to feel the ground beneath its sacred traditions shift, if only slightly, under creeping weight of change. As the golden age waned and the empire's borders drew inward like a tide receding from the shore, the world that had once revered Egypt's divine royalty began to question not just its authority, but its underlying logic. For while the grand temple still stood and priests still intoned the sacred rites beneath towering columns painted with the stories of gods and kings, the belief that had once animated these symbols flickered now with uncertainty, like a flame grown weary of its own flickering. And it was in this fragile light that even the once unchallenged practice of royal sibling marriage began to feel less like a pillar of heaven and more like a habit too old to abandon, a habit carried forward not because it served the living, but because it had been demanded by the dead. And as foreign emissaries arrived bearing customs from lands not ruled by divine kings or incestuous unions, a quiet tension rippled through the palace halls, where the cool marble floors reflected not just the past grandeur, but the slow encroachment of questions that no longer bowed before answers carved in stone. These foreign influences, arriving first as guests and then more ominously as conquerors or advisors, carried with them ideas and structures that had been born far from the Nile's banks, ideas that suggested leadership could be chosen rather than inherited, that divine favor might be a matter of ethics rather than blood, and that perhaps the gods did not dwell solely in the sacred family line, but in the actions of those who served justice and order. And while such notions were blasphemous to the high priests and deeply unsettling to the ancient scribes who had for centuries guarded the myths of the two lands, they found fertile soil in the hearts of those young nobles and court dwellers who had grown up staring at crumbling statues and half-empty treasuries, who had watched the sacred falcon banner fall from its unchallenged height into the hands of foreign rulers who did not fear its power, but saw through its worn illusion. Yet even in this climate of uncertainty and slow unraveling, the royal custom did not collapse immediately, for traditions rooted in divinity do not simply vanish in a single breath. Instead, they fracture quietly, like hairline cracks in an old stone wall, growing slowly beneath the surface where no one dares to look too closely, until one day the entire facade begins to shift and sag. not from a single blow, but from the quiet weight of time and truth pressing patiently against it. And so, it was that even as Rome's legions drew nearer and Ptolemaic Egypt began its final decline, the ruling house continued the ritual, with Cleopatra herself becoming both sister and wife in the final great echo of practice that had once served to mimic the gods and now served only to delay the inevitable loss of power that came not from foreign swords, but from the corrosion of belief. And in the quiet corners of palaces grown more empty than full, among the lingering shadows of once mighty ancestors whose names were still spoken, but whose meanings had grown opaque, a new generation rose, one that had inherited not the certainty of divinity, but the burden of preserving a myth no longer fully believed. And so they played their roles, the brother as king, the sister as queen, the union as sacred, but behind the painted eyes of their statues and the carefully arranged symbols of fertility and power, there was weariness, a weariness born of pretending that what was once meaningful still carried the same weight. And it was this weariness, rather than conquest, that finally dimmed the light of Egypt's divine marriages, like an oil lamp left untended in a forgotten tomb. And still, the question lingered in the air like the desert heat shimmering over ancient stones. Had it ever truly been love that bound them, these royal siblings who lay together beneath linen sheets and golden ceilings? Or had it always been obligation, the cold hand of dynasty pulling their hearts into alignment with fate that had been chosen for them long before their births? It is hard to know, for the language of their time did not speak of longing or reluctance in the way ours does. It spoke instead of order and chaos, of modern isfet, of balance in the abyss. And a lull within the sacred line was not romantic, nor even necessarily kind. It was simply right, and a question it would have been like questioning the rising of the sun or the flooding of a Nile, things which occurred not because one desired them, but because the world required them. Even so, the final generations of sibling rulers seemed to carry within their gaze, immortalized in marble and painted on papyrus, a kind of knowing sadness, the look of those who have played their part too many times, who have worn the same mask so long as become indistinguishable from their own face. And in that look we might glimpse the truth of what such unions cost, not in the ledger of history, but in the quiet chamber of a human soul, the loneliness of queens who were never courted, the isolation of kings who never dared to love freely, the silence between brother and sister that deepened not from absence, but from too much proximity, too much expectation, and the slow erosion of the self in the service of a name that no longer protected them from the shifting winds of fate. And as Alexandria's libraries burned and Rome's banners rose, as new gods supplanted the old and time swept clean the inscriptions of divine bloodlines and royal decrees, the practice that had once been the centerpiece of Egypt's sacred monarchy faded into memory, becoming not law, but legend, a story told in hushed tones by historians and archaeologists, a curiosity, a relic, a window into a world where gods were born of the same wombs as kings, and where marriage was not a matter of the heart, but the throne. And though the stones still whisper their secrets and the tombs still bear witness to those ancient unions, what remains is not the certainty that they were right or wrong, only the echo of their necessity, and the haunting beauty of a civilization that lived and died beneath the weight of its own mythology. And so it was that the ancient illusion of permanence, that comforting mirage which had once cloaked Egypt in the dignity of eternal rhythm and divine purpose, began to crumble not with sudden catastrophe, but with a slow and steady erosion of confidence. For by the time the Ptolemaic dynasty rose upon the ashes of native rule, the traditions that had once seemed so integral to the heartbeat of the Nile no longer pulsed with the same certainty. And yet the practice of sibling marriage endured, now no longer purely Egyptian in its sacredness, but adopted anew by a Greek ruling class who had, ironically, embraced the ritual as a symbol of legitimacy, as a theatrical gesture meant to cloak themselves in the mystery and majesty of the people they governed. And so, in the great palaces of Alexandria and in the shadowed temples of Upper Egypt, the unnatural unions continued, now repackaged in the language of Hellenistic royalty, but still rooted in the same obsessive desire to protect. Dynastic purity, and the irony, as it always does, lay hidden in plain sight, for in mimicking the traditions of a culture they never fully belonged to, the Ptolemies inadvertently prolonged a custom whose original rationale had already begun to fade, perpetuating a theater of control that had become more about symbolism than belief. And yet, the consequences of this continuation became tragically apparent, for in this final chapter of royal incest, The cause of intermarriage no longer remained buried beneath gilded titles or mythic justifications, but erupted into scandal, jealousy, and blood, as Ptolemaic siblings not only married one another, but frequently turned on each other with lethal cruelty, their entangled alliances giving way to betrayal, exile, and fratricide, until even the gods must have turned their eyes away. In weariness, unwilling to watch the sacred lineage reduced to a chain of poisoned banquets, whispered conspiracies, and desperate power plays, and nowhere was this descent more vividly displayed than in the life of Cleopatra VII, the last and most enigmatic queen of the Nile, who herself was married in turn to both of her younger brothers, each a pawn in the volatile struggle for control. And though she is often remembered for her liaisons with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, it was these enforced sibling unions that first shaped her reign, unions that were never based in affection but in obligation, in the stale air tradition gasping for relevance in a world that had already moved on. By the time Cleopatra looked out across the Nile and imagined a future for her people, she was not gazing with the eyes of a daughter of Isis, nor merely the descendant of Alexander's generals, but as a woman caught between centuries, a ruler born into an expectation so old it had fossilized, yet forced to navigate a world that no longer bowed before those ancient scripts. And the marriages she entered with her brothers were not sacred but strategic, not divine but desperate, as she clung to legitimacy in the face of growing Roman influence and internal unrest, and perhaps in those long hours beneath the painted ceilings of her palace, she too wondered if the cycle could ever be broken, if the throne might ever be separated from the twisted bonds of blood and duty, or if, like the old gods whose statues still stood in silent vigil, she too would be remembered not for what she changed, but for how she symbolized the end of something that had once seemed indestructible. In this twilight of empire, the once sacred sibling marriage stood naked in its contradiction, no longer protected by the aura of divinity or the consent of belief, but exposed as a tradition that had outlived its gods, its meaning reduced to ritual, its beauty eroded by time and by blood, until it became clear even to the priests and nobles who once revered it that such unions had always been less about the heavens and more about the earth, about power inheritance, and the unrelenting fear that to dilute royal blood was to invite collapse, a fear that ironically brought about the very decline it sought to prevent. For by closing the circle too tightly, by marrying within until the tree bore only brittle branches, the dynasty turned inward and decayed, still dressed in gold but hollow at the core. And when Cleopatra finally chose love over blood, choosing Antony, a Roman, a foreigner, a man not bound to her by ancestry, but by ambition and passion, it was as if the spell was finally broken, the chain finally unlinked, and though history would judge her harshly and Rome would cast her as a temptress and a threat, in truth her greatest defiance was not political but personal, for she stepped beyond the pattern, beyond the legacy of siblings turned spouses, and in doing so, she signaled the end of a world in which marriage had been a ritual cage and love a dangerous indulgence. And while her fate would be tragic, her gesture marked the final unraveling of belief that had once shaped empires, but now echoed only in tunes and stories, distant as the cries of priests in forgotten tongue beneath a sky no longer watching. As the last torch flickered out in the silent corridors of the House of Ptolemy, the marble floors worn smooth by generations of royal feet fell into darkness, and with them, so too did the ancient tradition that had endured beyond reason. For though the myth had once been luminous with divine promise, glowing the minds of kings and priests as a sacred design drawn directly from the will of the gods, it now lay abandoned, fragile and empty, like the withered husk of a long-dead lotus, drifting gently atop the current of the Nile. And those who came after, those Roman governors and Byzantine rulers, those Arab caliphs and European scholars who wandered in the shadow of the ruined temples and cracked obelisks, could scarcely comprehend the strange, secretive world that had once flourished along these banks, a world in which the most powerful rulers had looked not beyond their palaces for love or partnership, but inward, toward their own blood, their own mirror images, compelled not by romance but by ritual, by a kind of divine paranoia that warned against opening the royal gates to outsiders. It is strange, perhaps, to think of these long-vanished pharaohs, draped in gold, flanked by gods, standing motionless in profile on the temple walls. Not as distant myths, but as people, flawed and frightened, bound by the expectations of a system far older than themselves, for what may seem to us now as unnatural or grotesque once made perfect sense within the logic of the cosmos they had inherited. A cosmos which the sun rose each morning only because Ma'at, the eternal balance, had not been disturbed, and where every royal decision was less a matter of personal will than a piece of a sacred puzzle, carefully placed to maintain a harmony that even time itself could not threaten. And so when they married their sisters, they were not choosing love, nor indulging lust, but submitting to a blueprint believed to be as old as the stars, as necessary as the flood of the Nile. And in that submission they found comfort, believing that by echoing the gods, they too might become eternal. But eternity, like belief, is fragile when it rests solely on fear, and in time the mighty walls of belief cracked beneath the weight of history. For as generations passed and the reasons grew murky, as the lineages twisted into increasingly fragile threads, and as the very notion of divine kingship lost its resonance with the people who once bowed beneath it, what had once been sacred began to feel merely strange. And what had once been an emblem of purity came to be seen, in hindsight, as a prison of ritual. And so the practice, once invincible, faded, not in a blaze of moral awakening or public rebellion, but in silence, in slow forgetfulness, as newer dynasties turned toward newer customs, leaving the old gods and their unions to gather dust in the tombs. Yet even as the world turned its back on these gilded marriages, the fascination remained, for in the ruins of Luxor and the carvings of Karnak, in the scrolls of historians and the imaginings of storytellers, the image of the sibling spouses endures, haunting and strangely beautiful, a reminder of how belief can shape even the most intimate corners of life, and how power, when cloaked in divinity, can twist even love into a political tool. And as modern scholars sift through genetic data and read ancient papyri by the dim glow of museum lights, they find not only bones and names but questions, lingering like smoke in the corridors of time. Did these kings and queens believe they were truly gods? Did they feel love? Did they suffer in silence beneath the weight of their duty? Or were they so deeply embedded in their worldview that the concept of choice never even occurred to them? Perhaps the answers are lost, and perhaps that is fitting. For the story of sibling marriage in ancient Egypt is not, in the end, a story of individual hearts, but a civilization's attempt to make sense of eternity, to preserve itself against the ravages of time by creating closed loops of blood and power, circles within circles, thrones guarded not by armies but by ancestry, until the very idea of the outside became unthinkable. And though history would eventually render its verdict, labeling such unions as unnatural or misguided, it is important to remember that from within, the system felt sacred, rational, even necessary, and that every generation that continued the pattern did so with the weight of centuries pressing gently upon their shoulders. Now, as we drift further from that world with every passing century, and as the sands of the desert reclaim what remains of the golden halls and towering pylons, we are left not only with questions, but with wonder. For while the sibling marriages of the Pharaohs may seem a strange relic of a distant past, they remind us of something deeply human. The lengths to which people will go to preserve what they believe in, to protect a legacy, to embody an ideal, even when it demands the sacrifice of their personal desires. And perhaps, in this strange and haunting tradition, we glimpse not just the quirks of kings, but the quiet tragedy of those who live their lives not as themselves, but as symbols caught forever between the sacred and the human. So when you next picture a pharaoh seated upon his throne, flanked by falcons and wrapped in linen and lapis, try to imagine not just the splendor but the silence, the burden of knowing that even his marriage was not his own, that his every gesture had been prescribed by gods older than memory, and that even in his most private moments, he remained a vessel for a power far greater than himself. And in that imagining, you may find not only judgment but empathy, a quiet recognition that belief can be both beautiful and blinding, and that the stories we inherit often shape us in ways we cannot escape. And with that final image, as the stars rise once more above the black ribbon of Nile and the temples sleep beneath the drifting sand, we bring this story to its close. A tale not of love but legacy, not a desire but a duty, echoing still in the silence of tombs and the whisper of reeds. And now, dear listener, as the night deepens and your breath softens, may you carry with you not just the fact of history, but the hush of ages long past, where time moves slowly and gods watched closely, and kings married queens who were also their sisters, all in the name of something far greater than themselves. Sleep now, and let the dreams carry you across the sand, back into that ancient world where belief ruled all and where even love bowed before the throne.